So another subject I've seen a lot being asked about online is how the heck do you figure out where all the vacuum lines go on this truck? Because there are quite a few vacuum lines. As you can see, these vacuum actuator blocks, there's 9 vacuum connections there, and they're all over the throttle body. There's 3 in the front, there's 3 in the back, there's one on the fuel pressure regulator, and you can see they go everywhere. So I'll give you a run through of my vacuum system in case it helps for you, and I'll start at the throttle body just to make it a central point. So on the front you have 3 vacuum connections, and if we go over here to look down, the vacuum connection on the far driver's side, this one right here, this one goes to a T on mine, and there's a vacuum nipple on the bottom of the air box, which I'll show you here. Look at it. So it goes right here on the bottom, and then it branches out to this other vacuum line which goes to this valve, and this is the hot air intake from for a vacuum actuator that goes to something I don't have on my truck anymore. Is there's a little manifold that goes right here, and basically when it's cold outside, the engine sucks up hot air off the exhaust manifold, so it's not getting a blast of cold air. Mine, you can see it rusted away and I had to take it off, and the engine will work fine without it, and I leave it there just because, but you can plug that vacuum off if you want less vacuum headaches to deal with. And the other part of the T goes to your smog pump, and these 2 lines right here one goes to the back of the engine to a T-pipe that runs off the back of the exhaust manifold. You can kind of see it right there. There's one there, and the other one's right there, and the other line goes down all the way under the truck to the sorry, I was interrupted. They go down to the catalytic converter, and the catalytic converter, and this thing also has an oxygen sensor, will cause grief if the oxygen sensor is bad. It can cause the engine to die randomly, so you might want to check into that. It's not too difficult to get to. I can't see it from here very well, but if you look right there, you can kind of see it on the bottom. It's not difficult to get to. But going back to the vacuum system, the middle vacuum line goes to this little solenoid right here, and that goes to one end of your EGR valve, that long metal tube, and these can get clogged with carbon, as basically the EGR is a controlled vacuum leak. It leaks exhaust gas back into the intake, and the exhaust gas can be rich in carbon, especially if the engine's not running right. So you might want to pull this thing off if your truck's really old and never been serviced, because the exhaust port is kind of like under right here, can get completely plugged with carbon and prevent the EGR from working correctly. And the intake port is kind of on this side, so when you take this thing off, if you see only one port, there's really 2, and it could just be plugged up with carbon. I recommend using a vacuum cleaner to suck it out instead of poking at it and having carbon fall back into the engine, because that could cause problems. But moving on, the third vacuum line, which is closest to the passenger side, this goes to a check valve. And mine was blown out when I bought this truck, and I got this one off of eBay for probably $2 or $3. You don't want to get one from the auto parts store, because they'll charge you 10 times what these are worth. And these are a sore spot because carbon tends to get built up, because this is the same line. If you follow it all the way back, it's a bunch of T's, but it goes to the PCV system, and it'll suck up oil and garbage from the engine, and it tends to migrate all the way around and then go back into this port right here. But if we keep following that same vacuum line where the check valve is, and you want to make sure that the check valve is going towards the throttle body that way and not this way. And if you don't have this check valve in here, the engine tends to run poorly, and sometimes the air conditioner doesn't want to work right either. If you have AC, factory, I didn't think a lot of these came with AC. It was an option. So sometimes there's just a big pulley right here instead of the air conditioning compressor. But if we follow this continuing, it goes to this T, and then it goes into this big pile of vacuum lines. And all of these vacuum lines, I've moved mine up, but usually it's kind of hiding down here. It goes all the way around under the PCM, and then it goes to your charcoal canister, as there's 3 vacuum lines on here. There's 2 that go back to the engine, and then there's 1 that goes down, and I think that goes to the fuel tank, but I don't think mine's connected because I only have 2 connections into my fuel tank. So I'm not 100% sure where that goes, but it's not a vacuum leak because I can't find anything. But if you follow the canister back to the annoying blocks, I will get to this later, because this is a very sore spot with this vacuum system. But if you go to the back of the engine, you have up here, these are the fuel inlet and return, because this is a return fuel system. There's 3 vacuum lines, big vacuum lines in the back. Let me see if I got a flashlight on me. There's one right here. If I can find it. It's kind of hard to see. There we go. So that vacuum line right there that says fuel on it goes back to this canister right here. Oops. Getting blinded by the sun. And this canister is a filter. And if you follow it, if I can stop getting sunbursts on there, it goes behind that, and it goes over to your brake booster. And you want to make sure that this doesn't have any vacuum leaks, because if you have a vacuum leak at your brake booster, your brake pedal will sink to the floor and you won't have very good brakes. And this right here is if you have the optional cruise control, and I don't. And they really don't make any kind of good like nipple that goes over here, so I just got a piece of vacuum line and I filled it up with hot glue, and that seems to work the best because they tend to get cracks around right here, and then you'll have a vacuum leak, and you can see this one's kind of bulging out, so eventually it's probably going to start cracking and I'm going to have to replace it again. But there's also another connection that comes off, which is this, and this goes through the firewall way down here. You can kind of see it right there, those blue lines. Those go into the cab for your air conditioning, as all of the vents are actuated off of that. So if your vents are dumping to the floor, or if they're dumping to the defrost, or both, then you probably have a vacuum leak either right here, or there is a vacuum check valve up under the dash, and I'm not going to go find that because it's way too hot. And usually it's a gray line. I've replaced mine with blue, and if that has a leak in it, then your vents tend to not work. But a vacuum line comes back out. If you saw, there was 2 lines, and the other one goes from the AC system to your heater control valve. And so any leak in there can cause your vents to not work properly. And if you noticed, if you like press on the gas and your vents go to the floor and to defrost, that also means you have a slight vacuum leak. So the vacuum line here, I've kind of jimmy rigged up something, but it's basically 4mm tubing with I think this is 1/4mm, and I just kind of use it as a sleeve to get it on this nipple right here, because the ones they sell at the auto parts store, they're made in 2 halves. So if you have, see if I can find one. No, that one's not. But basically, if you have a tube that is too big and it starts bulging the outside of it like that, it'll eventually split and you'll get a vacuum leak there, and it's very annoying. If we go back to the back of the engine, there's another vacuum line kind of in the middle, that smaller one, and that goes to the middle, and that goes all the way up to this thing. And I think it has something to do with the throttle. It's on the firewall. I haven't quite looked it up yet, but there's a little vacuum connection there in the back. It's kind of hard to see it. And then the third vacuum line is right here, which is closest to the driver's side, and it belongs to that long T thing that goes back to the front of the throttle body. And the last vacuum line on the throttle body goes to your fuel pressure regulator. So there's a vacuum nipple over here, and I don't know if you can see it inside the throttle body, but there's a little hole right there, and that's where it gets its vacuum from. If you have a vacuum leak here, your engine may have problems developing any power. You might push down on the gas and it falls on its face, and it can run without it, but it won't run very well. So if you hear a hissing sound back here, it's most likely this thing, because there is quite a bit of vacuum going through that thing. And if you notice there's any like fuel pumping into the throttle body from that location, this thing is probably bad, and you'll definitely want to replace it, or you could get hydrolocked from too much gas dumping down the throttle body. So the next thing we'll look at are the vacuum actuators, and this is probably the most sore spot of this engine design. As far as I know, the 239 V6, excuse the rooster, the 239 V6 is the only one that has this really crappy setup. But basically, the first one, closest to the front, it goes, if I remember correctly, yeah, it goes to the vacuum solenoid, and then it goes to the EGR valve for the middle connection anyway. And the other 2 connections, if I remember correctly, yes, they go to this weird looking triple vacuum, and this goes into the intake right there, so it just comes off the intake. And the middle, if you look, the middle vacuum line on the middle triple one, that one goes over to the EGR valve as well, and it ends up right here on the top. And the other 2 vacuum lines, they end up over here at the charcoal canister. I don't know which is which, but it shouldn't matter too much which goes where, because it's just basically feeding through there. And the last ones, let me see here. So the middle right here again goes to the triple, and it goes to the intake. And the other two, I think one of them goes to this, which is a vent, and the other one goes over here. So now I remember the one where the two that go from this one of them goes to the vent and one of them goes to the charcoal canister. And again, I don't remember which. I really don't want to pull this apart because it's a real pain to get back together. So let me put this back. And if you notice, mine doesn't fit quite right. I had a mechanic change the engine and they broke this tube. And this tube's very expensive. Normally it sits way back there and it doesn't interfere with anything, but this is the tube they got, so I was kind of irritated about that. But they didn't want to pay the $70 for this tube, which is quite ridiculous, but this is a 30-year-old truck and these parts are kind of hard to find. So the next thing is this right here, and this is called an engine breather. It is not an EGR valve. Basically, the engine suction air from this tube from the air box goes on the side of the air box, and this is basically a filter to prevent crap from getting in the engine. And these can get clogged over time, and they can present a vacuum leak because there is a rubber grommet under them. And since I just changed this rubber grommet, I don't want to tear it by pulling it out. But the grommet can get cracked, and I'll usually see a crack around the side of it, and you might hear hissing going by there because the engine suction vacuum from that side. And if it gets clogged, it can make the engine run poorly, as they tend to get splash valved with oil. There is a baffle inside here, but if there's too much oil splashing, or if the engine's running too hot, or if you never change your oil, they can get oil fouled in here, and you'll have to replace them. They're generally available because they have been used on a lot of Chrysler products. The only other thing is the PCV valve, and these can be a sore spot too, because these grommets love to get dry rotted, especially because they're on top of the valve cover. They get quite hot, and you can see this is kind of turning yellow, and I might have to get another one soon. But if you hear something that sounds like a belt squealing, it might not actually be your belts, because these things can squeal if you have a vacuum leak or something wrong with the engine, because there's not enough solid vacuum, and the ball inside tends to bounce around. But that's pretty much the whole vacuum system on here. I hope it helps someone out.